The teacup rattled against its saucer without warning, a delicate porcelain percussion that cut through the afternoon quiet of the Essex countryside. Marianne Foyster paused mid-sentence, her pen hovering above the letter she'd been writing to her sister in London. The sound came again, not the gentle clink of china settling, but a deliberate, almost musical tapping that seemed to emanate from within the cup itself. She set down her pen and reached for the teacup, noting how the pale afternoon light streaming through the rectory's tall windows caught the tremor in the amber liquid. Earl Grey, still warm from the pot she'd prepared 20 minutes earlier. As her fingers closed around the delicate handle, the cup gave a sharp jolt, as if someone had flicked it from beneath. The porcelain slipped from her grasp. Time stretched. As she watched it fall, the cup rotating slowly, the tea forming a perfect amber arc in the air, droplets catching the light like tiny prisms. But instead of the expected crash against the flagstone floor of the dining room, the cup simply stopped, mid-air, 3 feet from the ground. It hung suspended for a heartbeat that felt like an hour, before gently setting itself down on the Persian rug below her chair. Upright, unbroken, not a drop of tea spilled. Marianne stared at the cup, her breath forming small clouds in air that had turned, suddenly, inexplicably cold. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued its steady tick, but every other sound seemed muffled, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and irregular, and somewhere in the walls around her, or perhaps beneath the floorboards, something that might have been footsteps, or might have been the old timber settling, began a slow, measured pace. From the kitchen came the sound of running water, though she knew she'd turned off all the taps. The footsteps continued, growing neither louder nor softer, but maintaining their deliberate rhythm like a metronome counting time in a key she didn't recognize. The smell of lavender, heavy and sweet, began to permeate the room. Strange, because it was February 1929, and no lavender had bloomed in the rectory's garden for months. She bent slowly to retrieve the teacup, her eyes never leaving its perfect, impossible position on the rug. As her fingers touched the rim, still warm despite its journey through cold air, she heard something that made her freeze entirely. Her name, spoken clearly in a woman's voice she didn't recognize, coming from the empty chair across from her. Marianne, not a question, not a greeting, simply her name, pronounced with careful enunciation, as if the speaker were trying the word out for the first time. The sound of running water stopped, the footsteps ceased. Even the grandfather clock seemed to pause mid-kick in the sudden, profound silence that followed. Marianne Foyster understood with absolute certainty that her life at Borley Rectory, the most haunted house in England, as it would come to be known, had just begun in earnest. What happened in that isolated Essex village, nestled between ancient churches and forgotten Roman roads, would eventually draw the attention of the Society for Psychical Research, the BBC, countless newspapers, and investigators from around the world. It would divide believers and skeptics, generate thousands of pages of testimony, and spawn debates that continue nearly a century later. But on that February afternoon, with a teacup defying gravity and her name hanging in the air like incense, Marianne Foyster knew only that something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of her ordinary world. The house, it seemed, had been waiting for her. Borley Village sits in the Suffolk-Essex border country like something from a Thomas Hardy novel, though Hardy himself might have found the place too quietly unsettling for fiction. The landscape here rolls gently between medieval churches and Roman foundations, where hedgerows older than memory divide fields that have been ploughed and planted for 1,000 years. In 1862, when the Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull first laid eyes on the plot of land where he would build his rectory, local farmers still occasionally turned up fragments of Saxon pottery and Roman coins with their spring planting. The Bull family chose their location with the particular confidence of Victorian England, a slight rise that commanded views of both the parish church of St. Michael and the ruins of Borley's medieval monastery. The monastery had been dissolved in Henry VIII's time, its stones carted away for more practical buildings, but locals had long memories. They remembered stories passed down through generations about monks who had violated their vows, about a novice nun from the nearby Bears Convent who had tried to elope with a lay brother, about a coach that still ran phantom midnight journeys between the old monastery grounds and the church. Henry Bull dismissed such tales as peasant superstition, but he was enough of a scholar to appreciate the historical weight of the place. The new rectory would be built in the Gothic Revival style, with tall windows, ecclesiastical arches, and enough rooms to house his growing family in proper Victorian comfort. 14 children would eventually call Borley Rectory home, and the house seemed to expand to accommodate them all. Rambling corridors, odd-shaped rooms, staircases that turned at unexpected angles, and a garden that stretched down toward the river and the old monastery grounds that the Bull children grew up treating the peculiarities of their home as normal features of country life. Footsteps in empty corridors were simply the house settling. Doors that opened by themselves were matters of loose hinges and uneven floors. The figure that several of them claimed to see walking in the gardener, woman in grey who seemed to glide rather than walk, always keeping to the same path between the lawn and the old monastery ruins, was simply one of those optical illusions that old light and older buildings tend to produce. Harry Bull, Henry's son, who would inherit both the living and the rectory, took a more systematic approach to the oddities. He kept a diary, noting dates and times when doors opened unexpectedly, when cold spots appeared in warm rooms, when the smell of incense permeated areas of the house far from the chapel. He documented the occasions when visitors reported seeing figures that didn't correspond to anyone actually present, and he paid particular attention to the recurring accounts of a woman in nun's garb who appeared most often at dusk, walking the same path through the garden by the time Harry Bull died. In 1927, the stories had begun to spread beyond the boundaries of Borley village. The Church of England, mindful of its reputation in an age of growing skepticism about religious matters, found itself in an awkward position. The living needed to be filled, but potential candidates had heard whispers. The rectory came with an unofficial reputation that made it difficult to place. The Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife took up residence in October 1928, determined to approach their new home with both Christian faith and rational modern thinking. They lasted less than a year. Mrs. Smith later told reporters that she had tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but normalcy proved elusive in a house where bells rang without human hands touching them, where objects moved from room to room overnight, and where the sound of hoofbeats on gravel announced arrivals that never materialized. The Smiths' departure created a crisis for the church authorities. Borley Rectory, with its 23 rooms and extensive grounds, represented a significant investment. More importantly, it housed the living for one of the oldest parishes in Essex. The solution came in the form of Lionel Algernon Foyster, a scholar and linguist who had spent years working in overseas missions. Foyster was a practical man, educated and experienced in dealing with unfamiliar situations. His young wife, Marianne, nearly 30 years his junior, brought a vitality and modern sensibility that seemed well suited to dispelling whatever atmospheric problems had troubled their predecessors. They moved into Borley Rectory in October 1929, accompanied by Marianne's daughter Adelaide from her previous marriage. The house welcomed them with what seemed like benevolent quiet. The first weeks passed peacefully, with Foyster settling into his parish duties and Marianne organizing the domestic arrangements of their new home. The garden showed signs of recent neglect from the Smiths' abbreviated tenure, but the structure itself seemed sound. Victorian Gothic was built to last. It was Marianne who first noticed that certain rooms remained consistently cold despite the furnace running properly. It was Marianne who observed that objects seemed to migrate not dramatically, but subtly, as if moved by someone who was trying to be helpful but didn't quite understand the household's organizational system. A book left on the kitchen table would appear on a shelf in the study. Garden tools stored in the shed would turn up neatly. Arranged by the back door, the local villagers watched the new residents with cautious interest. In rural Essex, 3 failed attempts to maintain stable residence in a house were enough to establish a pattern. The older residents remembered stories their grandparents had told about the monastery grounds, about monks who had lived and died. They're under circumstances that canonical records preferred not to detail. They remembered the tales of secret tunnels connecting the monastery to the convent in Bears, and they remembered the woman in grey who had been seen walking that same garden path since before any of them were born. But they also remembered the Bull family's long, largely peaceful residence, and they were prepared to give the Foysters the benefit of local discretion. If strange things happened at the rectory, well, strange things happened in old houses. The important thing was whether the new reverend could conduct proper services and whether his wife would contribute appropriately to village social life. Marianne Foyster proved popular with the village women. She was young, attractive, and possessed a lively intelligence that made her good company for tea and conversation. She spoke knowledgeably about books and politics, showed genuine interest in local history, and demonstrated an aptitude for the kind of practical problem-solving that rural life demands. When she mentioned odd occurrences at the rectory doors that seemed to open by themselves, cold spots that appeared without explanation, the occasional sound of footsteps in empty parts of the house, her neighbors listened with sympathy rather than alarm. Old houses, they agreed, had their peculiarities. The important thing was not to let such matters grow out of proportion, but proportion, as Marianne would soon discover, was not a concept that Borley Rectory appeared to understand. The first incident that couldn't be dismissed as imagination or natural occurrence happened on a Tuesday evening in November, barely a month after the Foysters had settled into their new home. Marianne was reading in the drawing room while Lionel worked on his sermon in the study and Adelaide did her schoolwork at the kitchen table. The house held that particular quiet that comes with domestic contentment, the soft turning of pages, the scratch of pen on paper, the gentle settling sounds of an old building relaxing into evening. The throwing began without warning, not dramatically, not with the crash and violence of a poltergeist tantrum, but with the measured deliberation of someone testing boundaries. A pebble appeared on the carpet beside Marianne's chair, as if dropped from a great height. She looked up from her book, scanning the ceiling for cracks or holes that might explain how a stone had found its way indoors. The ceiling was solid, unmarked Victorian plaster. Another pebble landed near the fireplace, then another by the window, not thrown with force. but placed with the gentle precision of someone distributing seeds in a garden. Each stone was roughly the same size, about as large as a child's marble, and each appeared to materialize in mid-air before dropping softly to the floor. Marianne called for her husband, who arrived to find her standing in the center of the room, surrounded by perhaps 24 small stones arranged in no particular pattern but with an unmistakable sense of intent. As they examined the stones together, more began to appear, not from any visible source, but manifesting in the space above their heads before settling gently onto the furniture and floor. Lionel Foyster's training in rational inquiry served him well. He checked the windows all closed and latched. He examined the ceiling thoroughly, looking for openings that might allow someone to drop objects from above. He climbed into the attic space to investigate whether a prankster might have gained access to the area above the drawing room. Everything appeared normal, undisturbed. Impossible. The stone throwing continued for 20 minutes, long enough for them to call Adelaide to witness the phenomenon. The 12-year-old watched with fascination rather than fear as pebbles continued to materialize and drop, sometimes forming rough circles, sometimes appearing to target specific pieces of furniture. When the activity finally ceased, they had collected nearly 60 stones, all similar in size and composition, all appearing to come from the gravel paths that surrounded the rectory. Lionel's first impulse was to document everything carefully. He noted the time, the weather conditions, the exact location where each family member had been when the throwing began. He sketched the patterns the stones had formed and saved several samples for later examination. His academic training demanded systematic investigation before drawing conclusions, but systematic investigation became increasingly difficult as the phenomena escalated. The stone throwing resumed the following evening, this time in the kitchen while Marianne prepared dinner. Again, the stones appeared to materialize from empty air before dropping gently to the floor. This time, however, they seemed to show a preference for landing near Marianne herself, as if drawn to her presence. Over the following weeks, the pattern expanded. Objects began to move without apparent cause, not violently, but with what seemed like purposeful intent. Kitchen implements would relocate themselves overnight. Books would migrate from shelf to shelf, sometimes opening to specific pages. The grandfather clock in the hallway began keeping irregular time, running fast for several hours, before suddenly correcting itself. Most disturbing was the writing. It began as single words, scrawled on scraps of paper that appeared in various rooms. Not messages, exactly, but isolated words that seemed to float up from some submerged vocabulary. Marianne, please help, cold. The handwriting was feminine but unfamiliar, written in pencil with the careful formation of someone who had learned penmanship in an earlier era. The words became phrases, then fragmented sentences. Marianne, please help get appeared on a piece of brown paper in the pantry. Light mass prayers was found written on the margin of a book in the study. Most unsettling was a message discovered on the mirror in the guest bedroom. Marianne, dear, please help me. Lionel Foyster's methodical approach to investigation began to strain under the weight of accumulating evidence. He had served in remote mission stations where local populations maintained beliefs in spirits and supernatural interventions. But his own faith had always been grounded in the rational, the explicable, the comfortably theological rather than the empirically mystical. The events at Borley Rectory challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. He began corresponding with colleagues who had encountered similar phenomena, reaching out to other clergy who had dealt with unexplained occurrences in their parishes. The responses varied widely. Some dismissed such events as delusions or pranks. Others acknowledged similar experiences but advised discretion. And a few suggested that certain places seemed to retain impressions of past events in ways that conventional understanding couldn't yet explain. Meanwhile, Marianne found herself becoming the focal point of increasingly personal manifestations. Objects appeared to follow her from room to room. The written messages addressed her by name with growing frequency and intimacy. Cold spots developed wherever she lingered for more than a few minutes, as if her presence triggered some kind of thermal disturbance. Most unsettling were the sounds that seemed to accompany her movements through the house. Footsteps echoed her own, staying precisely one beat behind as she walked down corridors. Doors opened just before she reached them, as if someone were courteously clearing her path. The sound of skirts rustling followed her upstairs, though she wore modern dresses that made no such noise. She began to feel watched, not with malevolence, but with an intensity that made privacy impossible. In the bathroom, she sensed someone standing just outside her peripheral vision. In the garden, she felt eyes tracking her movements from the upstairs windows, though when she turned to look, the windows were empty. Even in her bedroom, with the door locked and curtains drawn, she felt the presence of someone else sharing the space, someone who wanted desperately to communicate but lacked the proper mechanisms for interaction. The breaking point came in December, during the season of Advent, when the rectory should have been filled with preparations for Christmas services. Marianne was decorating the drawing room when she felt someone touch her shoulder, not roughly, but with the gentle pressure of someone trying to get her attention. She turned to find no one there, but on the table behind her, arranged in careful formation, were evergreen sprigs that she hadn't placed there. As she stared at the mysterious decoration, more greenery began to appear, holly branches materializing in midair before settling onto the mantelpiece. Ivy tendrils arranging themselves along the windowsills, mistletoe appearing above the doorway. Not scattered randomly, but placed with the aesthetic sensibility of someone who understood how to make a room beautiful for the season. The message that appeared later that evening was longer and more coherent than any previous communication. Marianne, dear, I have been trying to speak with you for so long. Please do not be frightened. I mean no harm to you or your family. I only want to tell you my story, to ask for your help in finding peace. The years have been so lonely, and you are the first person who seems to hear me clearly. Will you listen, Marianne? Read the message aloud to her husband, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows and set the bare branches of the rectory's trees into motion, their shadows dancing across the walls like gestures in a language neither of them could read. Lionel Foyster closed his eyes and made the decision that would transform their quiet country living into one of the most documented cases of alleged supernatural activity in British history. Yes, he said quietly, we'll listen. The house seemed to settle more deeply around them, as if something that had been holding its breath for a very long time had finally been given permission to exhale. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of Lionel's decision to engage with whatever presence inhabited the rectory, the phenomena intensified beyond anything they had previously experienced. The writing proliferated, not just single messages, but extensive passages that covered sheets of paper, margins of books, even sections of wallpaper. The handwriting remained consistent, a feminine script with the formal characteristics of late Victorian penmanship, written in pencil or sometimes in what appeared to be charcoal. The messages told a story in fragments, like pieces of a journal, scattered across time, references to life at the monastery, to restrictions and rules that had become unbearable, to love that had been forbidden but could not be suppressed. The writer identified herself as Marie, sometimes as Sister Marie, and spoke of waiting so long for someone who could hear. But alongside the communications came phenomena that suggested the situation was far from simple. Objects didn't just move, they flew across rooms with considerable force. The gentle stone throwing escalated into barrages of pebbles that struck walls and windows with enough impact to crack glass. Furniture began to relocate itself, not just drifting from place to place, but appearing to dance, spinning and sliding across floors in patterns that defied the laws of physics. The house itself seemed to become unstable. Doors slammed repeatedly throughout the night, creating a percussion symphony that made sleep impossible. Bells rang at all hours, not just the doorbell, but handbells that appeared from nowhere, church bells that seemed to emanate from within. The walls themselves, and a persistent ringing that had no identifiable source but filled the entire structure with metallic resonance. Temperature fluctuations became extreme. Rooms would be comfortable one moment and freezing the next, with ice actually forming on the inside surfaces of windows even when the furnace was running at full capacity. The cold spots that had initially been minor inconveniences became zones of Arctic intensity that made certain areas of the house temporarily uninhabitable. Most dramatically, the presence became visible. The first clear sighting occurred in January 1930, when Marianne encountered a woman in the hallway outside her bedroom. Not a glimpse or a peripheral impression, but a full, detailed apparition that stood in clear view for nearly a minute before fading gradually from sight. The figure wore what appeared to be a nun's habit, but in shades of grey rather than traditional black. Her face was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair visible beneath her veil and eyes that held an expression of desperate pleading. The woman extended her hand toward Marianne, her mouth moving as if speaking, though no sound emerged. She gestured toward the staircase that led to the upper floors, then toward the windows that faced the old monastery grounds. Her expression was one of urgent communication, as if she were trying to convey information of vital importance, but lacked the proper medium for transmission. Other family members began to see her as well. Adelaide encountered the figure in the garden, walking the same path that village tradition associated with the Grey Lady who had been reported for generations. Lionel saw her in his study, standing beside the bookshelf that contained his theological texts, her head bowed as if reading the titles with interest. Each sighting followed a similar pattern. The figure would appear solid and detailed, attempt to communicate through gestures, remain visible for anywhere from 30 seconds to several minutes, then fade gradually until she disappeared entirely. She never appeared startled by their presence, and her demeanor suggested sadness rather than malevolence. But the other phenomena suggested that whatever was inhabiting Borley Rectory was far more complex than a single earthbound spirit seeking resolution. The violence of some manifestations furniture that hurled itself across rooms, objects that struck walls with enough force to leave permanent marks indicated energies that seemed inconsistent with the gentle, pleading figure they had seen. The writing, too, became contradictory. Alongside the messages from Marie came others in different handwriting, with different voices and concerns. Some texts appeared to be in Latin, others in what Lionel tentatively identified as medieval French. A few messages seemed to come from male voices, referring to events and people that didn't correspond to Marie's narrative. The complexity of the phenomena attracted the attention of Harry Price, the most prominent paranormal investigator in Britain. Price had built his reputation on careful documentation of alleged supernatural events, applying scientific methodology to claims that typically relied on testimony and folklore. His investigation of Borley Rectory would eventually span decades and generate thousands of pages of documentation. But his first visit in 1929 established patterns that would define the case for years to come. Price arrived with instruments designed to measure and record anomalous phenomena, thermometers sensitive enough to detect minute temperature variations, cameras capable of capturing images in low light conditions, recording equipment that could document unexplained sounds, and motion detectors that would register movement when no one was present. His first night at the rectory provided more documentation than months of previous investigation. The instruments recorded temperature drops of up to 40 degrees in localized areas, with no corresponding changes in ambient conditions. The motion detectors triggered repeatedly in empty rooms, registering movement patterns that suggested someone walking back and forth across specific areas. Most significantly, the recording equipment captured sounds that appeared to be human voices. Though no one was speaking, the recorded voices were indistinct but clearly articulated, speaking words that sounded like English but were difficult to decipher completely. Analysis of the recordings revealed multiple speakers, both male and female, having what appeared to be conversations among themselves, rather than attempting to communicate with the living occupants of the house. Price's photographs produced images that became central to the Borley documentation. Clear pictures of objects in motion, furniture that appeared to be floating above the floor, and in several cases, human figures that were visible in the photographs but had not been seen by any of the people present. When the pictures were taken, most compelling was a photograph taken in the rectory's main hallway that showed a figure in nun's clothing standing at the foot of the staircase. The figure was translucent but clearly defined, and her posture matched exactly the descriptions that Marianne and other witnesses had provided of their encounters with the apparent spirit. But Price's investigation also revealed elements that complicated the narrative. His instruments detected electromagnetic anomalies that suggested possible natural explanations for some phenomena. The house's electrical system showed irregularities that could account for lights dimming or brightening unexpectedly. The building's foundation showed minor settling patterns that might explain some of the structural sounds attributed to supernatural causes. More troubling, Price's team discovered evidence of possible human interference with some phenomena. Certain objects that had allegedly moved by supernatural means showed fingerprints that could be matched to living occupants of the house. Some of the written messages contained references to contemporary events that seemed inconsistent with communications from centuries-old spirits. The investigation created a rift between those who saw Price's documentation as proof of genuine supernatural activity and those who interpreted his findings as evidence of elaborate fraud. The controversy was complicated by the fact that many phenomena occurred in Price's presence and under controlled conditions that made conventional trickery extremely difficult to execute. The debate intensified when other investigators arrived at Borley Rectory and reported similar but not identical experiences. The phenomena seemed to adapt to different observers, manifesting in ways that corresponded to their expectations and expertise. Photographers encountered visual anomalies, sound engineers documented unexplained audio phenomena, and psychologists observed behavior patterns that suggested genuine psychological impact on the witnesses. By the spring of 1930, Borley Rectory had become the most intensively investigated alleged haunting in British history. The documentation filled filing cabinets, the photographic evidence covered entire walls, and the testimonies from witnesses created a library of first-hand accounts that defied easy categorization. But for the Foyster family, living at the center of the investigation, the phenomena had become a daily reality that no amount of documentation could make manageable. The house no longer felt like home, it felt like a laboratory where they were simultaneously the researchers and the test subjects, documenting experiences that grew more intense and more personal with each passing day. The turning point came when the phenomena began to follow them outside the rectory itself. The expansion beyond the rectory's walls began subtly, with incidents that could initially be dismissed as coincidence or misperception. Marianne reported objects moving in shops while she conducted errands, in the village, items falling from shelves as she passed, displays rearranging themselves when her back was turned, cash registers that opened spontaneously during transactions. The shopkeepers, who had grown fond of the rector's young wife, attributed these incidents to accident or their own carelessness. But the pattern became undeniable when similar phenomena began occurring in the homes of people who had visited the rectory. Mrs. Henderson, who had come for tea to discuss the upcoming church fete, found her own kitchen rearranged overnight, with dishes relocated to different cupboards and utensils sorted into configurations she had never used. The arrangement was more efficient than her previous system, but entirely unfamiliar. Dr. Walton, the village physician who had attended Adelaide during a bout of winter flu, reported that his medical bag showed signs of having been meticulously reorganized between house calls. Instruments were cleaned and arranged with greater precision than his own habits provided, and medications were sorted according to a system he didn't recognize but found surprisingly logical. Most disturbing was the experience of the Reverend Mr. Henning, who had come from a neighboring parish to discuss ecclesiastical matters with Lionel. Following his visit to Borley Rectory, Henning found that his own church began experiencing phenomena similar to those reported at the rectory: bells ringing without human intervention, cold spots appearing during services, and the sound of footsteps. In the sanctuary, when the building was locked and empty, the phenomena seemed to be spreading, as if whatever inhabited Borley Rectory was establishing a network of influence that extended throughout the surrounding area. Harry Price's investigation team documented similar reports from as far as 10 miles away, all connected to people who had spent time at the rectory or had extensive contact with the Foyster family. The psychological impact on the Foysters themselves had become severe. Lionel, whose rational approach to ministry had been grounded in theological certainty, found his faith shaken by experiences that challenged his fundamental understanding of spiritual reality. The phenomena weren't fitting the categories his training had provided. They seemed neither purely divine nor obviously demonic, but something more complex and ambiguous that existed in theological grey areas. Adelaide, now 13, had begun to show signs of severe stress. Her schoolwork suffered as her concentration became increasingly difficult to maintain. She reported dreams in which the Grey Lady appeared and spoke to her in languages she didn't understand, conveying messages that felt urgent but remained incomprehensible. During the day, she felt constantly watched, as if invisible observers were monitoring her activities and judging her responses. But it was Marianne who bore the heaviest psychological burden. The phenomena had clearly focused on her as their primary point of contact, and the intensity of the attention had become overwhelming. She felt the presence of watchers every moment of the day and night. Privacy had become impossible, as cold spots and unexplained sounds followed her into every room. every activity, every attempt at solitude. The written messages had become increasingly personal and demanding. Instead of gentle requests for help, the communications now carried undertones of possessiveness and entitlement. "Marianne, you must not ignore me," appeared on her bedroom mirror. "I have waited too long for someone like you," was found written on the margins of her personal correspondence. "You belong here with me now," appeared scrawled across a page of her diary. The messages began to include information that seemed impossible for any historical spirit to possess. References to Marianne's childhood, to her first marriage, to private thoughts and fears she had never shared with anyone. The communications suggested a level of intimate knowledge that felt violating rather than supernatural. Most alarmingly, the phenomena began to show signs of active resistance to any attempt to leave or reduce contact. When Marianne spent a day visiting friends in London, she returned to find the rectory in chaos, furniture overturned, books scattered across floors, windows opened despite the winter weather, and messages covering every available surface demanding her immediate attention and promising punishment for her absence. The escalation reached a crisis point in March 1930, when Marianne was physically attacked by invisible hands while preparing breakfast in the kitchen. She reported feeling someone grab her arms and attempt to push her toward the cellar door, while an unseen voice hissed threats and accusations directly into her ear. The attack lasted only moments, but left visible bruises on her arms and a state of terror that took days to subside. Lionel contacted church authorities to request an emergency transfer, but the diocese proved reluctant to acknowledge the situation officially. The growing publicity around Borley Rectory had created an embarrassing situation for the Church of England, which preferred to handle such matters quietly rather than through newspaper headlines and public speculation. Moving the Foysters would require admitting that the church couldn't maintain control over one of its own properties. The compromise solution involved bringing in additional clergy to assist with what was diplomatically termed unusual pastoral challenges. The Reverend A.C. Henning, despite his own unsettling experiences, agreed to spend several weeks at the rectory to provide support and additional documentation. His presence seemed to calm the phenomena temporarily, as if the spiritual activities were uncertain how to respond to multiple religious authorities. But the respite was brief. Within days of Henning's arrival, the phenomena adapted to include him in their manifestations. He reported experiences identical to those of the Foyster family, objects moving in his presence, cold spots following him through the house, and the clear sense of being watched and evaluated by invisible observers. More significantly, Henning began to receive his own written communications, messages that addressed him by name and seemed to come from the same source as those directed to Marianne, but his messages carried different content, focused on theological questions rather than personal pleas. "Father, explain why we are trapped between worlds," appeared on his breviary. "God has abandoned us to this limbo," was found written on the altar cloth in the rectory's small chapel. The theological implications troubled Henning more than the physical phenomena. If genuine spirits were communicating through these messages, their understanding of their own spiritual condition seemed to contradict conventional teachings about the afterlife. They claimed to be caught in a state of limbo that prevented both resolution and rest, unable to move forward but equally unable to accept their current existence. The situation was further complicated by the pre-arrival of reporters and curiosity, seekers who had heard about the investigation. The quiet country rectory became a destination for people seeking entertainment or vindication of their own spiritual beliefs. Cars lined the lane leading to the house, and unauthorized visitors frequently attempted to gain access to the grounds. The publicity created additional stress for the Foister family while simultaneously making objective investigation more difficult. With crowds of observers present, it became impossible to distinguish between genuine phenomena and deliberate interference. Some visitors arrived hoping to witness supernatural events. Others came specifically to debunk the claims, and both groups brought their own agendas that colored their interpretations of what they'd experienced. Harry Price's documentation efforts became increasingly difficult to maintain under these circumstances. His instruments detected anomalous readings, but skeptics argued that the presence of multiple people with various electronic devices could account for electromagnetic irregularities. His photographs captured images that appeared to show paranormal activity, but critics pointed out that crowded conditions made controlled observation nearly impossible. The controversy reached national attention when the BBC requested permission to broadcast live from Borley Rectory. The proposal created a sensation. It would be the first time that alleged supernatural activity was documented through radio transmission, providing immediate access to phenomena that had previously been available only through written reports and still photographs. The broadcast was scheduled for Halloween night, 1930, with Harry Price providing commentary and the Foister family participating as witnesses. The program would either vindicate the claims about Borley Rectory or expose them as elaborate fraud. But in either case, it would bring the investigation to a definitive conclusion. As the broadcast date approached, the phenomena at the rectory intensified to levels that made daily life nearly impossible. Objects flew through the air with dangerous force. Windows shattered without apparent cause, and the written messages became threatening rather than pleading. "You will not make a spectacle of us," appeared on the bathroom mirror. "Silence the voices that seek to expose our private sorrows," was found carved into the wooden surface of the kitchen table. The house itself seemed to be preparing for a confrontation that would determine whether the spirits of Borley Rectory would find the peace they claimed to seek, or whether they would be condemned to remain trapped in the limbo they described with such desperate eloquence. The BBC broadcast would provide answers to questions that had been building for months, but those answers would prove more complex and disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The Halloween broadcast of 1930 would become one of the most controversial live radio programs in BBC history, though not for the reasons anyone expected. The evening began with meticulous preparation. Harry Price had positioned his recording equipment throughout the rectory. BBC engineers had tested every piece of transmission gear, and backup systems were in place to ensure that any genuine phenomena would be captured and broadcast to the nation. The Foister family had agreed to remain in the house during the broadcast, with Marianne serving as the primary witness for any communications or manifestations. The plan was straightforward. Price would provide commentary while the BBC equipment transmitted whatever occurred in real time, finally providing definitive evidence either for or against the supernatural activity that had been reported for over a year. The broadcast began at 9 o'clock on a cold, clear October evening. Price's introduction was measured and scientific, explaining the investigation methods and cautioning listeners that they might witness either genuine paranormal activity or the final debunking of elaborate fraud. His tone suggested confidence that the evening would resolve the controversy once and for all. For the first 30 minutes, nothing happened. The house remained quiet, the instruments detected no anomalies, and the Foister family sat in their drawing room answering Price's questions about their experiences while the nation listened. Marianne described the progression of phenomena from simple stone throwing to complex written communications. Lionel discussed the theological implications of their experiences, and Adelaide spoke briefly about the impact on her daily life. The mundane quality of the conversation began to work against the credibility of the entire investigation. Listeners heard a family discussing strange experiences in the same tone they might use to describe household repairs or garden planning. The dramatic, terrifying phenomena that had been reported in newspapers sounded like minor inconveniences when described in the calm atmosphere of a radio studio. Then, at exactly 9:47 p.m., everything changed. The first indication of trouble was a temperature drop so sudden and severe that it fogged the lenses of Price's cameras and caused the BBC engineers to check their equipment for malfunctions. The thermometers registered a 40-degree drop in less than 30 seconds, transforming the drawing room from comfortable warmth to Arctic cold. The second sign was the sound, not the gentle footsteps or door closing that had characterized earlier phenomena, but a cacophony that seemed to come from every part of the house simultaneously. Footsteps thundered in multiple directions, doors slammed in rapid succession, and underneath it all was a sound that the BBC engineers would later describe as resembling human voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify. But what made the broadcast legendary was what happened to the transmission itself. At 9:52 p.m., while Price was attempting to describe the chaos erupting around him, his voice was interrupted by another voice speaking directly through the BBC microphones, not overlaid or mixed in from another source, but speaking through the same transmission system with perfect clarity and impossible origin. "This is our home," the voice said, distinctly feminine and speaking in accent that linguists would later identify as consistent with educated speech patterns from the late Victorian era. "You have no right to make us into entertainment for your listeners." Price's attempts to respond were cut off by a second voice, masculine and speaking in what appeared to be Latin. BBC engineers frantically checked their equipment, convinced that someone had gained unauthorized access to their transmission frequencies. But every piece of gear showed normal operation with no external interference. The voices continued for 12 minutes, sometimes speaking individually, sometimes overlapping in what sounded like heated discussion among themselves. The female voice that had spoken first addressed the radio audience directly. "We are not performances for your amusement. We are people who lived and loved and suffered, and we deserve better than to be treated as curiosities." The transmission captured what appeared to be arguments among multiple spirits, with voices disagreeing about whether to continue communicating or to withdraw entirely from contact with the living. The female voice that had identified herself as Marie in written messages pleaded for understanding and help, while other voices expressed anger at the violation of their privacy. Most unsettling was a voice that seemed to speak directly to Marianne, though she was not near the microphones. "You promised to listen," it said with profound sadness, "but listening has become exploitation. We trusted you, and you have betrayed that trust for public spectacle." The phenomena escalated beyond vocal communication. The BBC equipment began registering sounds that corresponded to violent physical activity, crashes, impacts, and what sounded like large objects being thrown against walls. Price's attempts to document what was happening were hampered by the chaos erupting throughout the house, with his instruments detecting multiple simultaneous anomalies that overloaded his recording capacity. The transmission became increasingly difficult to maintain as electromagnetic interference began affecting the BBC's broadcasting equipment. The signal faded in and out, carrying fragments of voices, unexplained music, and at one point what sounded like church bells ringing with impossible volume and resonance. At 10:15 p.m., the transmission cut off entirely. BBC engineers worked through the night to restore the signal. But when they finally re-established contact with Borley Rectory, they found the house in silence. Price reported that all phenomena had ceased at the exact moment the transmission failed, leaving the rectory in a state of profound quiet that felt more ominous than the previous chaos. The aftermath of the broadcast created a sensation that far exceeded the original publicity around Borley Rectory. The BBC received thousands of letters from listeners who had heard the voices, many containing detailed transcriptions of the conversations that proved the transmissions had been received, clearly across Britain. But the corporation also received angry complaints from those who felt the broadcast had been an elaborate hoax designed to increase listener interest in paranormal programming. Analysis of the recorded material proved inconclusive. The voices were definitely present on the transmission, speaking words that could be transcribed and analyzed, but their origin remained unexplained. Technical examination of the BBC equipment showed no evidence of tampering or external interference. Yet the voices had somehow used the broadcasting system to communicate directly with the listening audience. More troubling were the long-term effects on the Foister family. In the days following the broadcast, Marianne fell into a depression that lasted for months. She reported feeling that she had violated the trust of beings who had turned to her for help, transforming their private suffering into public entertainment. The written messages that had been a regular feature of their experience ceased entirely, as if the communicating spirits had withdrawn from contact. Lionel Foister's faith was shaken beyond recovery. The broadcast had either validated the existence of earthbound spirits who were suffering in ways that conventional theology couldn't explain, or it had revealed that his family had been deceiving themselves and the public for over a year. Either conclusion challenged his ability to continue in ministry. The Church of England's response was swift and decisive. The diocese announced that the Foister family would be transferred to a different living, officially for pastoral reasons, but clearly to distance the church from the controversy. Borley Rectory would remain vacant while church authorities determined how to handle the property. Harry Price's investigation continued, but under changed circumstances. The phenomena had become sporadic and minor compared to their previous intensity. Temperature anomalies still occurred, objects occasionally moved without explanation, and sensitive individuals reported feeling watched or experiencing cold spots. But the dramatic manifestations that had characterized the Foister years appeared to have ended. The BBC Broadcast had achieved its goal of providing definitive documentation, but the evidence it produced satisfied neither believers nor skeptics. Those convinced of supernatural activity pointed to the impossible voices as proof that consciousness survived death and that some spirits remained earthbound. Skeptics argued that the technical anomalies proved nothing except that electromagnetic equipment could malfunction in ways that produced apparently meaningful patterns. The controversy was complicated by the emergence of additional witnesses who claimed to have experienced similar phenomena in other locations. Reports came from across Britain of people who had listened to the broadcast and subsequently experienced paranormal activity in their own homes' cold spots, moving objects, and in some cases, written messages that seemed to come from the same sources that had communicated through Borley Rectory. The possibility that the Broadcast had somehow activated dormant spiritual activity in multiple locations, created a new category of concern. For both religious authorities and scientific investigators, if consciousness could survive death and communicate across distances, the implications extended far beyond a single haunted house in Essex. But for the residents of Borley village, the end of the Foyster occupancy brought relief. The crowds of investigators and curiosity seekers departed. The constant stream of reporters ended, and the rectory returned to the quiet isolation that had characterized it before the phenomena began. The house stood empty through the winter of 1930-31, its windows dark and its rooms echoing with memories of voices that might have been human, might have been fraught, or might have been something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between conventional understanding and the mysteries that rational thought could not yet accommodate. The empty rectory attracted a different kind of attention than the crowded investigation of the Foyster years. Without the daily drama of flying objects and mysterious messages, Borley became a destination for people seeking quieter forms of contact with whatever might remain within its walls. Psychic investigators arrived hoping to sense residual energies. Artists came looking for inspiration in a place where reality seemed more flexible than usual. And scholars appeared with equipment designed to measure electromagnetic anomalies that might explain the reported phenomena. Captain W.H. Gregson, a retired military officer with an interest in psychical research, negotiated a lease with church authorities to occupy the rectory temporarily. Gregson brought a methodical approach to investigation, maintaining detailed logs of temperature variations, electromagnetic readings, and any unusual occurrences. His residency, which lasted from 1931 to 1934, provided a sharp contrast to the chaotic Foyster years. Gregson's experience was characterized by subtlety rather than drama. He reported occasional cold spots, particularly in the hallway where Marianne had encountered the Grey Lady, and intermittent electromagnetic anomalies that his instruments detected but couldn't explain. Objects sometimes appeared to move slightly, books shifted position on shelves, papers relocated themselves on his desk, kitchen implements turned up in unexpected locations, but nothing approached the violent phenomena of earlier years. Most significantly, Gregson never reported receiving written communications or seeing clear apparitions. The house seemed to have entered a dormant phase, as if whatever consciousness had inhabited it during the Foyster years had withdrawn to some deeper level of concealment. But Gregson's systematic documentation revealed patterns that previous investigators had missed. The anomalous readings occurred most frequently during specific weather conditions, particularly during the low-pressure systems that preceded storms. Temperature drops corresponded to electromagnetic spikes, suggesting a possible connection between the reported supernatural activity and natural atmospheric phenomena. His logs also showed that activity increased during certain calendar periods, the weeks surrounding the traditional dates associated with the old monastery, religious holidays that would have been significant to medieval monks, and most notably during the anniversary periods of dates that appeared in the historical communications attributed to Marie. Gregson's theory, developed over 3 years of careful observation, suggested that Borley Rectory might be subject to some form of psychic recording phenomenon in which traumatic or emotionally significant events became somehow imprinted on the physical environment and played back under specific atmospheric conditions. This would explain both the consistent nature of the reported phenomena and their apparent response to human presence and emotional sensitivity. The theory gained support from the experiences of occasional visitors who reported phenomena that seemed to correspond to their own psychological states. Individuals dealing with grief often reported sensing overwhelming sadness emanating from certain rooms. People experiencing relationship difficulties frequently reported the sound of crying or arguing voices. Those with strong religious backgrounds tended to report phenomena with distinctly spiritual characteristics, while skeptical visitors often experienced mechanical or electromagnetic anomalies that seemed to match their expectations. But careful documentation also revealed elements that couldn't be explained by simple psychic recording. The electromagnetic readings showed patterns that seemed to respond to human presence in ways that suggested intention rather than mere reaction. Temperature changes occurred in sequences that appeared purposeful, as if someone were trying to communicate through environmental manipulation. Most puzzling were the occasions when his instruments detected what appeared to be focused attention. Motion sensors would trigger in empty rooms, but the readings showed patterns consistent with someone standing and observing rather than moving through the space. Camera equipment positioned to monitor empty areas sometimes malfunctioned in ways that suggested deliberate interference rather than random technical failure. During Gregson's residency, Harry Price continued his research, though with less dramatic results than during the Foister years. Price's focus shifted from documenting spectacular phenomena to analyzing the accumulated evidence from the previous investigations. His review of thousands of photographs, hours of audio recordings, and extensive written testimony began to reveal patterns that had been obscured by the intensity of day-to-day occurrences. Price's analysis suggested that the phenomena at Borley Rectory followed consistent rules, even if those rules didn't correspond to normal physical laws. The manifestations appeared to require human presence to achieve full intensity, but they also seemed to have independent existence that continued at lower levels when the house was unoccupied. The communications showed consistent personality, characteristics that persisted across different investigation periods and different witnesses. Most significantly, Price's research began to uncover historical correlations that supported some of the information contained in the mysterious messages. Church records from the medieval period, previously unavailable or unexamined, contained references to events and individuals that matched details from the communications attributed to Marie and other spirits. The discovery of these historical correlations created new controversy within the investigation community. Believers pointed to the matches as validation that genuine spirits were communicating information that had been lost to conventional historical record. Skeptics argued that the historical research had been conducted after the messages were received, making it impossible to determine whether the communications contained genuinely unknown information or whether the historical correlations had been unconsciously influenced by the content of the messages. The debate intensified when Price's team discovered physical evidence that appeared to support some of the historical claims made in the written communications. Excavation in the rectory's garden revealed foundation stones that matched descriptions of buildings mentioned in the messages. More dramatically, they found what appeared to be a concealed chamber beneath the rectory's cellar that contained artifacts consistent with medieval monastic life. The artifacts included fragments of illuminated manuscripts, pieces of religious vestments, and, most controversially, what appeared to be personal items that matched descriptions found in the written communications. A silver locket contained a miniature portrait that resembled descriptions of Marie provided by witnesses who claimed to have seen her apparition. A piece of jewelry bore an inscription that corresponded exactly to phrases found in several of the mysterious messages. The archaeological findings provided the most tangible evidence yet discovered that connected the reported phenomena to specific historical events and individuals. But they also raised new questions about the nature of the communications and the identity of their sources. If genuine spirits were providing accurate historical information, it suggested that consciousness survived death with remarkable clarity and retention of memory. If the communications were fraudulent, they demonstrated an extraordinary level of historical research and physical preparation. The controversy was further complicated by the emergence of additional witnesses who claimed to have experienced similar phenomena in other locations associated with medieval religious sites. Reports came from former monastery grounds, ancient churches, and even private homes built on land that had once belonged to religious communities. The pattern suggested either a widespread survival of monastic spirits or a psychological tendency for people to interpret ambiguous experiences in terms of historical religious imagery. Captain Gregson's final report, submitted to the Society for Psychical Research in 1934, concluded that Borley Rectory was the site of genuine, anomalous phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional scientific understanding. But he also noted that the phenomena appeared to be diminishing over time, as if whatever consciousness had manifested there was gradually losing the energy or motivation necessary to maintain contact with the physical world. His observation proved prophetic. After Gregson's departure, the rectory remained vacant for several years, during which reports of unusual activity became increasingly rare and minor. The house seemed to be returning to the quiet normality that had characterized it during the early Bull family years, before the phenomena began. But the quiet wouldn't last. In 1937, new occupants would arrive at Borley Rectory, and their experiences would bring the investigation full circle, confirming some theories while raising entirely new questions about the nature of the intelligence that seemed to inhabit one of England's most mysterious houses. The final chapter of Borley Rectory's haunted history began with Captain W.G. Hart, a retired Navy officer who leased the property in 1937 with the express intention of conducting a systematic investigation into the reported phenomena. Hart had followed the previous investigations with professional interest, and he brought a naval officer's approach to organizing what he intended to be the definitive study of the house's anomalous properties. Hart's methodology differed significantly from his predecessors. Rather than simply documenting phenomena as they occurred, he attempted to create controlled conditions that might trigger specific types of activity. He installed motion picture cameras with timing mechanisms that could record activity in empty rooms, set up audio recording equipment that operated continuously, and created detailed maps of the house that noted the exact locations where specific types of phenomena had been reported previously. His approach initially seemed successful. The recording equipment captured footage of objects moving without apparent cause. Audio recordings preserved sounds that corresponded to footsteps and voices in empty areas of the house, and the motion detectors registered activity patterns that seemed to follow the traditional routes associated with the Grey Lady sightings. But Hart's systematic investigation also revealed disturbing patterns that previous residents had not recognized. The phenomena appeared to be intensifying again, as if responding to the focused attention of serious scientific study. Temperature variations became more extreme. Electromagnetic anomalies increased in frequency and magnitude, and new types of manifestations began to appear. Most concerning was the emergence of what Hart classified as direct intervention phenomena events that seemed designed to interfere with the investigation itself. cameras malfunctioned at crucial moments, recording equipment produced static that obscured potentially significant audio, and written logs disappeared from locked filing cabinets only to reappear days later with additional notations in unfamiliar handwriting. The added notations proved particularly unsettling, written in margins and between lines of Hart's careful documentation. They appeared to be corrections and clarifications provided by someone who had intimate knowledge of the events being recorded. When Hart noted that he had heard footsteps in the upper hallway at 11:47 p.m., someone had added 11:43 p.m. in pencil. When he described a cold spot as being approximately 6 feet in diameter, the notation precisely 7 feet, 4 inches appeared beneath his entry. The corrections were consistently accurate when Hart was able to verify them through his instruments, suggesting that whoever was providing the additional information had access to more precise data than his equipment could measure. But the implications were deeply troubling. It meant that his every activity was being observed and evaluated by an intelligence that could manifest physically enough to write but remained invisible to direct observation. Hart's investigation was interrupted by an event that would fundamentally change the nature of the Borley Rectory case. On February 27, 1939, a fire broke out in the early morning hours, spreading rapidly through the old building and destroying most of the structure before local fire services could respond effectively. Hart escaped uninjured, but the rectory was reduced to little more than foundation walls and scattered debris. The fire's origin remained officially undetermined, though investigators noted several peculiarities. It appeared to have started in multiple locations simultaneously, spreading in patterns that defied the normal behavior of structural fires. Witnesses reported seeing flames that burned in colors not typically associated with burning wood and fabric, and several people claimed to have heard voices calling for help from within the building, even after it had been verified that no one remained inside. Most mysteriously, the fire seemed to avoid certain areas of the house entirely. The chapel, which should have been among the most vulnerable areas due to its wooden furnishings and decorative elements, remained largely intact. The room that had served as Marianne Foyster's study, where many of the written communications had been discovered, was found with its contents relatively undamaged despite being surrounded by completely destroyed areas. Harry Price arrived at the scene within hours of the fire and immediately began documenting the ruins. His investigation of the burned structure revealed artifacts that had been concealed within the walls and beneath floorboards, evidence that supported some of the historical claims made in the mysterious communications. Among the most significant discoveries was a cache of documents that had been hidden behind a false wall in what had been the rectory's main hallway. The papers included correspondence dating from the late Victorian period that mentioned unusual occurrences at the monastery site, architectural plans that showed tunnel systems connecting the rectory to the old monastery grounds, and most remarkably, a journal written by someone who identified herself as M.L. and described experiences very similar to those reported by later residents. The journal entries, written in handwriting that closely resembled the mysterious messages received during the Foyster years, described encounters with apparitions, cold spots, and moving objects that matched the phenomena reported in the 1920s and 1930s. But the journal was dated 1885, more than 40 years before the Foyster family's arrival, suggesting that the paranormal activity at Borley had a much longer history than previously documented. The fire also revealed physical modifications to the rectory's structure that hadn't been visible during the building's occupied periods. Hidden passages connected different areas of the house. Concealed chambers provided spaces where someone could move through the building without being observed, and a complex system of speaking tubes allowed communication between rooms that appeared to be completely separate. The discovery of these hidden architectural features raised new questions about the source of some reported phenomena. Footsteps heard in empty corridors might have come from concealed passages. Voices that seemed to emanate from walls could have traveled through speaking tubes, and objects that appeared to move by supernatural means might have been manipulated by someone using the hidden access routes. But the structural discoveries didn't explain all of the documented phenomena. The electromagnetic anomalies recorded by multiple investigators couldn't be accounted for by hidden passages. The photographic evidence showed manifestations that occurred in open areas where concealment would have been impossible, and the consistency of witness testimony across different time periods suggested genuine, anomalous activity rather than elaborate human deception. Price's investigation of the ruins continued for several years after the fire, with periodic excavations revealing additional artifacts and architectural features. The work confirmed that the rectory had been built on a site with a complex history of human occupation, including structures that predated the medieval monastery by several centuries. Archaeological analysis revealed multiple building phases, with evidence of Roman occupation, Saxon settlements, medieval religious buildings, and the Victorian rectory all layered on the same location. The site appeared to have been continuously occupied for more than 1,000 years, with each generation of inhabitants leaving physical traces that remained buried beneath subsequent construction. The layered history provided a possible explanation for the complexity of the reported phenomena. If the site retained psychic impressions from multiple periods of occupation, the manifestations might represent overlapping memories from different historical eras rather than communications from specific individual spirits. This theory gained support from analysis of the written messages, which showed linguistic characteristics that spanned several centuries. Some communications used vocabulary and syntax consistent with medieval Latin texts. Others reflected Victorian English patterns, and a few contained elements that suggested even earlier linguistic influences. The fire marked the end of Borley Rectory as an occupied residence, but it didn't end the reports of unusual activity. Visitors to the ruins continued to experience phenomena similar to those reported during the building's inhabited periods. Cold spots appeared among the foundation stones. Electromagnetic anomalies were detected by sensitive equipment, and occasional witnesses reported seeing figures moving among the debris. The site's reputation attracted a steady stream of researchers, curiosity seekers, and believers in paranormal activity. The ruins became a pilgrimage destination for people interested in supernatural phenomena, and the surrounding area developed a cottage industry of ghost tours, paranormal investigators, and souvenir shops catering to visitors seeking connection with the mysterious events that had made Borley Rectory famous. But serious scientific study of the site continued as well. The Society for Psychical Research maintained an ongoing monitoring program, documenting any anomalous activity and maintaining detailed records of the site's condition and the experiences of authorized researchers. The accumulated documentation from nearly a century of investigation created one of the most comprehensive case studies in paranormal research, but it also demonstrated the limitations of conventional scientific methods when applied to phenomena that seem to exist outside normal physical laws today. The ruins of Borley Rectory stand like broken teeth against the Essex sky. Foundation stones marking the outline of rooms where teacups once floated in mid-air and messages appeared. on mirrors in feminine handwriting that no living person recognized. The site draws a different kind of visitor now. Not the crowds of sensation seekers who flocked there during the height of the phenomena, but individuals who come seeking something quieter, more personal, more difficult to name. The village of Borley has learned to coexist with its reputation. Local residents speak matter-of-factly about the occasional researcher who appears with electromagnetic sensors and thermal imaging cameras, about the heritage tourists who arrive with guidebooks and cameras, about the genuinely gifted psychics who claim to sense residual energies among the ruins. The pub serves a drink called the Grey Lady now, and the gift shop sells postcards featuring Harry Price's famous photographs. But these commercial touches feel gentle rather than exploitative, acknowledgements of history rather than sensationalized. Entertainment. The Church of England never rebuilt the rectory. The parish of Borley is now served from a neighbouring village, and the site itself has been designated as an area of historical interest, protected from development but open to authorized research. The old monastery ruins, which figured so prominently in the communications attributed to Marie, have been partially excavated, revealing foundations and artifacts that confirm much of the medieval history referenced in the mysterious messages. Scientific analysis of the accumulated evidence continues to evolve. Modern equipment has detected electromagnetic anomalies at the site that persist decades after the last reported manifestations. Temperature variations that follow patterns similar to those documented during the active periods, and acoustic properties that might explain some of the reported voice phenomena. But each technological advance that explains one aspect of the Borley mystery seems to reveal new puzzles that resist conventional understanding. The written communications remain perhaps the most compelling evidence for genuine paranormal activity. Forensic analysis has confirmed that the messages attributed to Marie were written in a consistent hand that matches no known living person from the relevant time periods. The historical information contained in the communications has proven accurate in every detail that can be verified through contemporary records, including references to events and individuals that weren't documented in publicly available sources until decades after the messages were received. But the human cost of the Borley phenomena shouldn't be forgotten in the fascination with evidence and explanation. The Foyster family never fully recovered from their experiences at the rectory. Marianne suffered from depression and anxiety for years after leaving Borley, always feeling that she had somehow failed the desperate spirits who had turned to her for help. Lionel's faith never recovered from the challenge to his theological certainties, and he left the ministry entirely, spending his remaining years in secular employment that kept him far from anything resembling pastoral care. Adelaide, who had been 12 when her family moved to Borley, carried the psychological impact of the phenomena throughout her life. She rarely spoke publicly about her experiences, but private correspondence later, donated to Psychical Research Archives, revealed that she continued to feel watched and followed for decades after leaving the rectory, as if whatever presence had focused on her family had never entirely released its attention. The investigators, too, paid prices for their involvement with Borley Rectory. Harry Price's reputation was permanently divided between those who saw him as a pioneering researcher who documented genuine supernatural phenomena, and those who considered him a publicist who exploited human credulity for personal fame. The controversy followed him throughout his career, coloring every subsequent investigation and making it difficult for him to receive serious academic consideration for his research methods and findings. Captain Hart, whose systematic approach had seemed so promising, emerged from his abbreviated residency, convinced that some phenomena lay permanently beyond human understanding. His final report to the Society for Psychical Research concluded that Borley Rectory represented a convergence of influences that cannot be reduced to simple explanations of fraud, delusion, or conventional natural causes, but which also cannot be definitively classified as proof of survival after death or communication with discarnate intelligences. The question that haunted all serious investigators was whether they had encountered genuine spirits seeking resolution, or whether they had documented something else entirely, some form of consciousness or energy that existed in ways that human understanding couldn't yet accommodate. The phenomena seemed too complex for simple fraud, too consistent for mass delusion, but also too ambiguous for definitive proof of specific supernatural claims. Modern paranormal research has moved beyond the simple believer versus skeptic debates that characterize the Borley investigations. Contemporary approaches recognize that consciousness itself remains imperfectly understood, that the relationship between mind and physical reality continues to generate scientific puzzles, and that phenomena, like those reported at Borley, might eventually be explained by discoveries in quantum physics, neuroscience, or fields of study that don't yet exist. The site continues to generate occasional reports of unusual activity. Visitors sometimes experience cold spots among the ruins. Sensitive individuals report feeling watched or followed, and electromagnetic equipment occasionally registers anomalies that correspond to the patterns documented during the rectory's occupied periods. These contemporary phenomena are generally subtle, brief, and far less dramatic than the manifestations of the 1920s and 1930s. But they maintain the connection between past and present that makes Borley Rectory a continuing puzzle rather than simply a historical curiosity. The ruins themselves have achieved a kind of equilibrium with their reputation. The foundation stones have settled into the landscape, partially overgrown with ivy and surrounded by gardens that bloom with flowers, planted by visitors who feel moved to beautify a place associated with sadness and searching. The atmosphere is peaceful rather than frightening, melancholy rather than threatening, as if whatever intelligence once struggled to communicate through flying objects and mysterious messages has found some form of rest. But on certain evenings, when the light fades and mist rises from the river that runs past the old monastery grounds, visitors to the ruins report experiences that echo the phenomena of earlier decades. A figure in grey moves along the same path where the Bull family. Children first reported seeing the Grey Lady more than a century ago. Cold spots appear without explanation. The sound of footsteps follows visitors along the lane that leads to the village, keeping pace but never quite catching up. And sometimes, on paper left by researchers, or carved lightly into the weathered stones of the foundation, messages appear that seem to come from the same source that once wrote so desperately to Marianne Foister. Brief notes, usually just a few words, that speak of longing and memory and the difficulty of letting go. Still here, remember us. Thank you for listening. The messages offer no solutions, no final revelations that might resolve the mysteries of Borley Rectory once and for all. Instead, they serve as reminders that some questions might be more important than their answers, that the boundary between the living and the dead might be less definite than comfortable assumptions suggest, and that love and loss can create connections that persist in ways that rational thought cannot easily map or measure. Whether those messages come from genuine spirits, from some form of environmental recording that plays back emotional imprints, or from the psychological needs of people who want to believe that consciousness survives death and that love transcends the grave, they continue to appear. They remind visitors that Borley Rectory's greatest mystery might not be whether ghosts exist, but why human beings so desperately need to believe that they do. The ruins stand in their quiet Essex meadow, holding their secrets and their stories, waiting for the next generation of investigators who will bring new technologies and new theories to bear on phenomena that have resisted explanation for nearly a century. The Grey Lady still walks her path between the old monastery grounds and the village church, following routes laid down in centuries past and continuing journeys that began before anyone now living can remember. And in the space between doubt and faith, between scientific method and human longing, between the evidence of the senses and the mysteries of consciousness, Borley Rectory remains what it has always been, the most haunted house in England, where the boundary between the known and the unknowable grows thin, and where visitors still catch glimpses of possibilities that exist just beyond the edge of comfortable understanding. The questions that brought investigators to this remote Essex village in the first place remain as compelling today as they were when Marianne Foyster first heard her name spoken by a voice she couldn't see, in a world increasingly dominated by technology and scientific certainty. Places like Borley Rectory serve as reminders that mystery persists, that consciousness might be more complex than current understanding suggests, and that some of the most important human experiences might occur in territories that reason alone cannot fully explore. If you find yourself drawn to these darker corners of human experience, these places where the ordinary world reveals cracks, that might lead to something extraordinary. You know where to find more nights like this. The ruins of Borley Rectory still stand, still wait, still whisper their secrets to anyone patient enough to listen for voices that speak in languages older than words, carrying messages that might come from the past, or the future, or the eternal. Present where love and loss meet in spaces that exist between heartbeats, between breaths, between the moment when you believe and the moment when you doubt. Some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed. Some questions, once asked, continue to echo long after the voices that asked them have faded into silence. And some places, once touched by mystery, remain forever changed, forever strange, forever balanced on the edge between this world and whatever worlds might lie just beyond the boundary of what we dare to call real. The teacup still falls, somewhere in the space between memory and possibility. It still hangs, suspended for that impossible moment before settling gently onto Persian rugs that exist now only in photographs and testimonies and the dreams of people who believe that love is stronger than death, that consciousness survives the dissolution of the brain, and that some stories are too important to end simply because the storytellers have moved beyond the reach of ordinary conversation. In the ruins of Borley Rectory, all possibilities remain open, all questions continue to echo, and all the various truths of human experience, the scientific and the spiritual, the rational and the mystical, the provable and the hoped for, coexist in the same space where a young woman once heard her name spoken by a voice that might have belonged to someone who died centuries ago, or might have belonged to someone who had never lived at all, or might have belonged to someone who understood that the categories of living and dead are too simple to contain the full complexity of what it means to be conscious in a universe that generates mystery faster than human minds can solve it. The investigation continues, as it always has, as it always will, in the space between questions and answers, between skepticism and faith, between the world we think we understand and the worlds we've yet to discover.